The coffee cup hit the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot, brown liquid spreading across Frank Morrison's kitchen floor like spilled blood. His weathered hands shook as he held the cream-colored wedding invitation, the kind of expensive paper that whispered money with every fold. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air. His old percolator had been going too long while he stared at those elegant gold letters. Rebecca Morrison Whitmore cordially invites you. But it was the handwritten note tucked inside that stopped his heart cold. Rebecca's familiar cursive, still neat as a schoolteacher's after all these years. Frank, I want all our old friends to see what I escaped from. Please come so they understand why I needed a real man. The screen door creaked in the morning breeze. Somewhere down the street, Mrs. Henderson's rooster was crowing, and the mail truck was already pulling away from the next house. Frank's father's watch ticked steady on his wrist. 37 years of marriage, and this is how it ended. But that was only the beginning. Frank set the invitation on his kitchen table and reached for the paper towels. 65 years old, and he was still cleaning up his own messes. Story of his life seemed like. The coffee had spread under the refrigerator, dark and bitter as his thoughts. He got down on his knees, joints protesting like old hinges, and mopped it up slow and careful. No sense rushing. Wasn't like he had anywhere important to be. He read the invitation again. Rebecca's wedding. Third Saturday in June, 2:30 in the afternoon at Millfield Country Club. The same place they'd celebrated their own anniversary every year for 3 decades, back when she still pretended to love him. Cordially invites. Hell, there wasn't nothing cordial about that handwritten note. She might as well have slapped his face. The phone rang. Frank glanced at the caller ID, his neighbor, Martha Henderson. Probably saw the mail truck and wondered about his morning routine. Martha noticed everything from her kitchen window, bless her heart. Morning, Martha. Frank, you all right? Heard something crash over there. He looked down at the coffee-stained floor. Just dropped my cup is all. Clumsy old fool. You're neither old nor foolish, Frank Morrison. Don't let me hear you talking like that. Martha had been saying things like that ever since Rebecca left 2 years ago, always trying to prop him up, like he was some kind of charity case. Maybe he was. I'm fine, Martha. Thanks for checking. You sure? I could come over, bring some of that apple pie you like. Frank's throat tightened. Martha Henderson was a good woman, best neighbor a man could ask for. 70 years old and still looking after everyone on the block like a mother hen. Her husband Bill used to say she had enough kindness for the whole county. That's real thoughtful, but I'm okay. Just got some reading to catch up on. After he hung up, Frank walked through his modest house, invitation still in his hand. Every room held memories of Rebecca, the living room where she used to curl up with her nursing journals, the bedroom where they'd planned their retirement together, the back porch where she'd told him she was leaving. I need more than this, Frank, more than you can give me. He'd asked what he could do different. She'd just shaken her head like he was too simple to understand. In his bedroom, Frank opened the dresser drawer where he kept important papers. Their divorce decree, final as death. The deed to the house, all his now, for what it was worth. And underneath, wrapped in tissue paper, their wedding photo from 43 years ago. Rebecca in white lace, smiling like she meant it. Frank in his best suit, the same one he still wore to church when he bothered going. They looked so young, so sure of forever. He set the wedding photo on his nightstand next to the invitation. Old love and new cruelty side by side. The house felt too quiet. Frank went back to the kitchen and started another pot of coffee. The old percolator gurgled and hissed, same as it had every morning for 20 years. Some things stayed reliable, even when everything else fell apart. Through the window, he could see Martha's Victorian next door, all painted up neat and proper. Her late husband had been handy with tools. Frank's own place showed its age, peeling paint, loose gutters, a front porch that sagged just enough to notice. Rebecca used to nag him about the upkeep. What will people think, Frank? Now he knew what people thought. Poor old Frank Morrison. Couldn't even keep his wife happy. No wonder she ran off with that businessman from the city. The fresh coffee smelled better than the burnt mess he'd spilled. Frank poured himself a cup and sat at his kitchen table, invitations staring up at him like an accusation. 37 years of marriage, raised no children together. Rebecca said they couldn't afford it, then later said they were too old. Built no fortune, his factory job paid decent but nothing fancy. Left no legacy except a house that needed painting and a reputation as the man whose wife got away. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe her new husband could give her things Frank never could. Carl Whitmore owned half the businesses in the county, from what Frank heard. Drove a Mercedes, belonged to the country club, took fancy vacations. Frank drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and took his vacations in his own backyard. The invitation felt heavier than paper should. Rebecca wanted him to come to her wedding, wanted their old friends to see what she'd escaped from. Frank Morrison, the man who wasn't enough. Outside, Martha's screen door slammed. Frank looked up to see her crossing the yard between their houses, carrying something covered with a kitchen towel. She knocked on his back door, gentle but insistent. "Frank, I know you said you were fine, but something tells me you're not." Frank opened the door, and Martha stepped inside, carrying what smelled like heaven itself. Apple pie, still warm from the oven. Her gray hair was pinned back neat as always, and her blue eyes held the kind of concern that made a man feel both grateful and foolish. "Martha, you didn't need to." "Hush." She set the pie on his counter and turned to face him, hands on her hips like a schoolteacher who'd caught a student in a lie, which Frank figured wasn't far from the truth. Martha had taught third grade for 40 years before retiring. She could spot trouble from 3 counties away. Her gaze fell on the wedding invitation still lying open on his kitchen table. "Oh, Frank." Her voice went soft as cotton. "That woman. It's fine." The words came out rougher than he meant. "She's got every right to get married again." Martha picked up the invitation, read it quick, then found the handwritten note. Frank watched her face change from concern to something harder, something protective. "This is cruel, Frank. Pure, calculated cruel." Maybe she's got a point. Frank poured himself more coffee, hands steadier now. Maybe folks should see what she escaped from. "Don't you dare!" Martha's voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced down 1,000 playground bullies. "Don't you dare let her make you believe that nonsense." Before Frank could answer, 3 small tornadoes burst through his back door without knocking. Tommy Jr., Sarah, and Michael, the Kellerman kids from 2 towns over. Frank had been looking after them weekends and summers since their daddy died in that mining accident last year. Good kids, even if they had more energy than a power plant. "Grandpa Frank!" Sarah threw herself at his waist, all 9 years of her wrapped around him like a barnacle. The boys flanked him, grinning like they'd found buried treasure. "Easy there, little darlin'." Frank's voice warmed up the way it always did around the children. "Y'all are supposed to be in school." "Teacher in service day," Tommy Jr. announced. He was 10 and serious about important matters like school schedules. "Mom dropped us off early, said you wouldn't mind." Frank didn't mind. These 3 had become the light of his life since Rebecca left. Their mother Janet worked double shifts at the diner to make ends meet. Frank was happy to help however he could. "Course I don't mind. Y'all hungry?" "Always," Michael said. At 8, he was the baby but had an appetite that could bankrupt a restaurant. Martha cut generous slices of pie while Frank poured milk. The children chattered about their plans for the day, something involving the creek behind Frank's property and a fishing expedition that would probably end with everyone soaked and muddy. "What's that fancy paper?" Sarah pointed at the invitation. "Nothing important, sweetheart." But Tommy Jr. was already reading over Frank's shoulder. Kid was too smart for his own good sometimes. "It's a wedding invitation. Says here, Rebecca Morrison Whitmore." He looked up at Frank with those serious dark eyes. "That's your ex-wife, isn't it?" "Tommy," Martha warned. "She's getting married again," Frank said, simple and plain. No point lying to children. They had a way of sniffing out the truth anyway. Sarah's face scrunched up like she'd tasted something sour. "The mean lady who made you sad?" Frank's throat tightened. He'd tried to keep his hurt private, but children saw more than adults gave them credit for. "She's not mean, honey. We weren't right for each other." "Bull hockey," Martha muttered under her breath. Language, Frank warned, but his heart wasn't in it. Michael climbed onto Frank's lap, getting pie crumbs on both of them. You don't gotta go to her stupid wedding, Grandpa Frank. You can stay here with us. Yeah, Sarah nodded firmly. We'll have our own party, with fishing and s'mores. Tommy Jr. stood straighter, looking older than his 10 years. If she hurt you, she's not welcome here. That's what Daddy used to say about people who weren't kind. Frank felt something crack open in his chest. These children, who'd lost their own father, were trying to protect him from his own heartache. Their fierce loyalty made his eyes burn. Y'all are something else. He hugged them close, breathing in the smell of childhood, bubble gum and sunshine and infinite possibility. But sometimes grown-ups have to do things that don't make sense to kids. Martha cleared her throat. Frank, could I have a word? Outside? The tone said it wasn't really a request. Frank got the children settled with second helpings of pie and followed Martha onto his back porch. The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of a lawnmower. There's something you need to know, Martha said, her voice low and urgent. Something I probably should have told you before now. Frank leaned against his porch railing, the wood rough under his palms. Martha looked nervous, which wasn't like her. In the 40 years he'd known Martha Henderson, she'd always been steady as sunrise. What's on your mind? She glanced back through the screen door, making sure the children were still busy with their pie. It's about your finances, Frank. Your real situation. Frank's jaw tightened. If this is about charity, Martha. Hush and listen. She pulled a manila envelope from under her arm. My Bill, before he passed, he made me promise to look after you. Not because you needed looking after, but because, she paused, choosing words careful as a surgeon, because you've got more than you know. Martha, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I know exactly how much money I got. It ain't much. No, Frank, you don't. Her voice carried that teacher authority again. Bill managed some investments for you, cryptocurrency, through his nephew's tech company. You remember giving Bill power of attorney for that small inheritance from your brother Tommy? Frank nodded slow. After his brother died 5 years back, there had been some paperwork about digital assets. Frank didn't understand computers, so he'd let Bill handle it. Figured it was worth maybe a few $100s. Well, that few $1,000s Bill invested for you? Martha opened the envelope and pulled out bank statements. It's grown some. Frank looked at the papers, numbers swimming in front of his eyes. He had to read it 3 times before it sank in. This says, his voice came out as a whisper. This can't be right. $2,300,000, Frank, give or take the market fluctuations. The porch seemed to tilt under his feet. Frank sat down hard in his old rocking chair, the same one his daddy used to sit in, the same one where he'd held each of the Kellerman kids when they cried for their dead father. I don't understand. Why didn't anyone tell me? Martha's face softened. Bill wanted to wait until the accounts matured, and then when he got sick, she touched his shoulder gentle. I've been managing it for you, following his instructions, making sure you were taken care of without you having to worry about it. But I've been living like... Frank gestured at his modest house, his old truck in the driveway. Like a man who knows the value of a dollar, like someone who doesn't need fancy things to be happy. Martha smiled. Bill always said that was your strength, not your weakness. Inside the house, the children's laughter drifted through the screen door. Tommy Jr. was telling some elaborate story about a fish that was probably growing with each telling. Normal sounds, safe sounds. There's more, Martha continued. That land your daddy left you? The mineral rights? The old strip mine? That's worthless. Been played out for decades. Martha shook her head. Not anymore. New survey shows rare earth deposits. The mining company's been trying to buy mineral rights in that area for months. Yours are worth... She consulted another paper. Conservative estimate, 800,000. Frank's hands shook worse than when he'd read Rebecca's invitation. Why are you telling me this now? Because of that. Martha pointed at the invitation visible through the screen door. Because Rebecca's trying to make you feel small when you're anything but. And because, she hesitated, because I think there's more going on here than just a wedding invitation. The smell of apple pie and children's joy mixed with the honeysuckle air. Frank felt like he was waking up from a long dream, or maybe falling into one. Martha, I need you to be straight with me. All this money, these investments, are they real? Or are you trying to make an old man feel better about himself? She pulled out her phone, opened an app, and showed him the screen. Numbers, real numbers, updating in real time. Real as rain, Frank Morrison? You're a wealthy man who's been living poor by choice. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Frank could answer, Tommy Jr. stuck his head out the door. Grandpa Frank? There's a man on the phone says he needs to talk to you about some legal papers. Says it's about your ex-wife and it's urgent. Frank took the call in his kitchen while Martha kept the children busy on the back porch. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer from the county seat, professional, clipped, and carrying bad news like a disease. Mr. Morrison, this is attorney James Walsh. I represent your ex-wife, Rebecca Morrison Whitmore. We need to discuss a restraining order she's filed against you. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. Through the window, he could see Tommy Jr. showing the younger ones how to skip stones in a puddle left by yesterday's rain. Restraining order? What for? Mrs. Morrison Whitmore has expressed concerns about your mental state and potential for harassment. She's documented several instances of what she considers stalking behavior. Stalking? Frank's voice rose enough that Martha looked through the screen door, concerned. He lowered it. I haven't been anywhere near Rebecca in 2 years. According to our documentation, you've driven past her place of employment on multiple occasions. You've made inquiries about her personal life through mutual acquaintances. And now, despite being asked not to contact her, you received a wedding invitation, which she claims she never sent. Frank felt the walls closing in. That's a lie. She sent that invitation herself, with a handwritten note telling me to come. Do you have this alleged note, Mr. Morrison? Frank looked at the invitation on his table. The envelope was there, but the handwritten note. He'd been so upset when Martha arrived, so distracted by the children. Where had he put it? It was here just a minute ago. Mr. Morrison, my client is concerned about your increasingly erratic behavior. The wedding invitation was sent by mistake, an oversight by the printing company. All former spouses were accidentally included on the list. That's not true. The note was handwritten. She wanted me to come so people could see what she escaped from. Mr. Morrison, I think you need to consider the possibility that your grief over the divorce has caused you to imagine things that didn't happen. The phone felt slippery in Frank's hand. Outside, Sarah was giggling at something Michael had said. Normal, innocent sounds from a world that suddenly felt very far away. What does she want? Complete cessation of contact. No driving by her workplace, no questions about her through third parties, and absolutely no appearance at her wedding. In exchange, she's willing to overlook this incident without involving law enforcement. Frank sank into his kitchen chair. And if I don't agree? Then we'll be forced to pursue harassment charges. Mrs. Morrison Whitmore has witnesses who will testify to your unstable behavior. Your reputation in the community could suffer significantly. After Frank hung up, he sat staring at the invitation. Had he imagined the handwritten note? The stress of the divorce, the loneliness, the feeling of being cast aside, could it have made him see things that weren't there? Martha came back inside, reading his face like a book. What did they want? Rebecca's saying, I've been stalking her, says the invitation was a mistake, and I imagined the handwritten note. Frank's voice sounded hollow even to himself. Says if I show up at her wedding, she'll have me arrested. Martha's face went hard as winter stone. Show me that invitation again. Frank handed it over. Martha studied it close, then walked to the window where the light was better. Frank, look at this envelope. Really look at it. She pointed to the address. Frank's name and address were written in the same careful cursive as the note he remembered, but now, looking closer, he could see something else. The ink was slightly different, darker in some places, lighter in others, like it had been written at different times. Someone added to this, Martha said quiet. after it was originally addressed. You think the note was real? I think Rebecca Whitmore is playing games that would make a chess master dizzy. Martha folded the invitation careful and put it in her purse. But I also think she's made a mistake. Frank felt a spark of something. Not quite hope, but not despair either. What kind of mistake? The kind that happens when greedy people get too clever for their own good. Martha's eyes held a glint Frank hadn't seen since her husband Bill was alive. Tell me something, Frank. That mineral rights land. Does Rebecca know about it? She knew Daddy left me some worthless property. Never paid it much mind. And your brother's inheritance? The money Bill invested for you? Rebecca was already talking divorce when Tommy died. Figured it was just some old computer files, maybe a few savings bonds. Martha smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Oh, Frank. I think I see what's happening here. Rebecca's trying to scare you away from that wedding for a reason, and I don't think it has anything to do with harassment. Before Frank could ask what she meant, Tommy Jr. burst through the back door, soaking wet and grinning. Grandpa Frank, come look what we caught in the creek. It's the biggest crawdad you ever seen. But over the boy's shoulder, Frank could see a familiar car pulling into his driveway. Carl Whitmore's silver Mercedes, gleaming like a predator's smile in the afternoon sun. Frank stepped onto his front porch as Carl Whitmore climbed out of the Mercedes. Even in the afternoon heat, the man wore a suit that probably cost more than Frank's monthly Social Security check. Everything about Carl screamed money. The gold watch, the perfect haircut, the way he moved like he owned whatever ground his feet touched. Frank Morrison? Carl's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to getting his way. I'm Carl Whitmore. Ah, I believe you know my fiancée. I know Rebecca. Carl smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mind if we talk? Man to man? Frank glanced back through the screen door. Martha was keeping the children occupied, but he could see her watching through the kitchen window. Tommy Jr. had gone quiet, the way kids do when they sense adult trouble brewing. Speak your piece. Carl stepped closer, lowering his voice like they were old friends sharing secrets. Look, Frank, I know this situation is awkward for everyone. Rebecca's told me about the difficulties you've been having since the divorce. What difficulties would those be? The phone calls to her work, driving by her apartment. The lawyers say you've been having some confusion about reality lately. Carl's tone was gentle, like he was talking to a child or someone touched in the head. I understand grief can do that to a man. Frank felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. I haven't called Rebecca or driven by anywhere she lives. Of course you haven't, not on purpose. Carl nodded sympathetically. But sometimes when we're hurting, we do things we don't remember. The mind plays tricks. It was smooth as silk, the way Carl made Frank's denial sound like more evidence of confusion, like being sane was just another symptom of being crazy. What do you want, Whitmore? I want to help. Carl reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Rebecca feels terrible about this whole mess. The invitation was a mistake, the printer's error. She never meant for you to think you were welcome at our wedding. The words hit like a slap, but Frank didn't flinch. So she sent you to make sure I understand I'm not wanted. She sent me to make sure you get the help you need. Carl held out the envelope. There's information about a very good facility in the city. Counseling for men dealing with divorce trauma. Rebecca would be happy to contribute to the cost. Frank stared at the envelope like it might bite him. Mental health treatment, paid for by his ex-wife and her rich fiancé. The ultimate charity case. That's real generous of her. She still cares about you, Frank. We both do. But you have to understand, if you show up at our wedding, if you continue this pattern of behavior, we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement. Frank heard Martha's screen door open. She stepped onto her own porch, arms crossed, watching. The children had gone quiet inside his house. I appreciate you coming by, Frank said, his voice steady as his father's old watch. But I don't need counseling, and I don't need charity. Carl's smooth mask slipped just a little. Frank, be reasonable. Look at your situation. Look at this place. He gestured at Frank's modest house, the peeling paint, the sagging porch. Rebecca's moved on to a better life. Don't you think it's time you accepted that and moved on too? Frank looked at his house, really looked at it, saw the flower boxes Martha had helped him plant last spring, the porch swing where he'd held Sarah through her nightmares about losing her daddy, the kitchen window where warm light spilled out during the children's visits. "You're right," Frank said quiet. "Rebecca has moved on to what she thinks is a better life." Carl smiled, thinking he'd won. "But see, that's where you and I disagree about what makes a life better." Frank stepped closer, close enough to smell Carl's expensive cologne. "I got 3 children who call me grandpa and mean it. I got a neighbor who watches out for me like family. I got enough to eat and a roof that don't leak and the respect of folks who matter." Carl's smile faded. "You tell Rebecca I received her message loud and clear, and you tell her I'll be just fine without her charity or her pity." Frank turned to go back inside, then paused. "Oh, and Whitmore, you might want to ask Rebecca about them mineral rights before you say I do. Just friendly advice from one man to another." The color drained from Carl's face like water from a broken bucket. Frank watched Carl's Mercedes disappear down the street, leaving nothing but dust and the smell of expensive exhaust. Inside the house, he could hear the children's voices rising in excitement, probably planning their creek adventure again. Martha crossed over from her porch, moving with the purposeful stride of a woman who'd made up her mind about something. "Well, that was interesting," she said, settling into the porch chair beside Frank's rocker. "Man looked like he'd seen a ghost when you mentioned them mineral rights. Seemed to know something about them, didn't he? More than he should, if this was just about Rebecca wanting you to stay away from her wedding." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Frank, I think it's time we had a talk with Cal Turner." Cal Turner was the closest thing Millfield had to a wise man, retired lawyer who'd handled most of the town's legal business for 40 years before hanging up his shingle. If anyone could make sense of this mess, it'd be Cal. "You think he'd see us on short notice?" "For you, Cal would see you at midnight if you needed him." Martha stood, brushing dust off her dress. "Let me call him while you get yourself cleaned up. We're going to town." 20 minutes later, Frank found himself in the passenger seat of Martha's sensible sedan, wearing his church clothes and feeling like a man heading to his own trial. The children had been disappointed about cutting their visit short, but Janet had agreed to pick them up early when Martha explained there was urgent business to handle. "Grandpa Frank?" Sarah had asked before leaving. "Are you in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. Just got some grown-up things to sort out." "If that mean lady is bothering you again, we'll come help," Tommy Jr. had declared with the fierce determination of someone who'd already lost one father figure. Now, driving through downtown Millfield's quiet streets, Frank felt the weight of their loyalty like a stone in his chest. Good kids deserved better than getting caught up in his mess. Cal Turner's office sat above the old five and dime, unchanged since Frank was a boy. The same creaky stairs, the same frosted glass door with gold lettering that needed touching up. Cal himself looked like he'd been carved from the same oak as his desk, solid, weathered, reliable. "Frank Morrison," Cal said, rising to shake hands. "Heard you had some visitors today." Frank shouldn't have been surprised. In a town the size of Millfield, news traveled faster than gossip at a church social. Word gets around quick. "Attorney Walsh called me about an hour ago. Wanted to know if I thought you were mentally competent to handle your own affairs." Cal's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Told him I'd known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and your mind was sharper than his ever hoped to be." Martha set her purse on Cal's desk with a decisive thump. "Cal, we need to know what Rebecca and that Whitmore character are really up to. This isn't just about keeping Frank away from some wedding." Cal nodded slow, the way he did when he was working through a complicated problem. "Show me what you got." Frank produced the wedding invitation, while Martha pulled out the financial documents. Cal studied both with the methodical care of a man who'd spent decades reading between lines. "This handwriting analysis Martha mentioned, she's right about the ink differences. Someone added to this invitation after it was originally addressed." Cal set the invitation aside and picked up the bank statements. "And these mineral rights. Frank, do you know what rare earth elements are worth these days?" Martha said something about 800,000. "Try closer to 2 million. If the survey reports I've been hearing about are accurate. Cal leaned back in his chair. See, there's been some quiet activity in the county recorder's office lately. A lot of mineral rights transfers, all being bought up by shell companies. Frank felt that familiar tightening in his chest. What kind of shell companies? The kind that trace back to business interests owned by one Carl Whitmore. Cal's eyes held no humor now. Frank, I think your ex-wife found out about your mineral rights somehow. And I think she's been planning this whole thing. The wedding invitation, the harassment charges, even getting you declared mentally incompetent to force you into signing over those rights. The office went quiet except for the old radiator hissing in the corner. Frank stared at the financial papers, seeing his life's worth laid out in black and white. You're saying she wants to steal from me. I'm saying she already tried to steal from you, and when that didn't work, she's trying to gaslight you into thinking you're crazy. Martha's voice carried the righteous anger of a woman who'd spent decades protecting children from bullies. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Cal Turner smiled, the first genuine smile Frank had seen from him in years. We're going to give Mrs. Morrison Whitmore exactly what she asked for. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a legal pad. Frank, how would you feel about attending that wedding after all? That night, Frank sat on his front porch until past midnight, rocking slow and steady while his mind churned like a storm-tossed sea. Cal Turner's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Show up at the wedding looking prosperous and dignified, let Rebecca and Carl reveal their true intentions in front of witnesses, then produce the real mineral rights deed that would expose their scheme. The only problem was Frank felt about as dignified as a scarecrow in a thunderstorm. Martha had gone home around 10, after making sure he understood every detail of what they'd planned. The children were safely back with their mother, probably dreaming about crawdads and summer adventures. The whole world seemed to be sleeping peaceful while Frank wrestled with demons that felt bigger than he was. The screen door creaked as he went inside to make coffee. His hands shook as he measured the grounds. Not from fear exactly, but from something deeper, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying shame too long. Standing in his kitchen at midnight, Frank finally admitted the truth he'd been hiding from himself for 2 years. Part of him believed Rebecca was right about him. Poor old Frank Morrison, not enough for a woman like her. Not smart enough, not rich enough, not man enough to keep what he'd promised to love and protect. The coffee finished percolating with its familiar gurgle and hiss. Frank poured himself a cup and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the spot where the wedding invitation had been. Cal Turner had taken it as evidence, along with the financial papers and Martha's careful notes about the handwriting analysis. You're a good man, Frank, Cal had said before they left his office. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. But sitting alone in the dark, Frank wondered if being good was enough. Rebecca had called him boring, predictable, small-town simple. Maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe a man who found his greatest joy in children's laughter and honest work and Sunday morning coffee wasn't built for the kind of battle that lay ahead. The phone rang, shrill as a fire alarm in the quiet house. Frank glanced at the clock. 12:47 a.m. Nothing good ever came from phone calls after midnight. Hello? Heavy breathing on the other end, then a voice Frank recognized but had never heard so slurred with alcohol. You son of a bitch! Carl Whitmore, drunk and angry and probably calling from some bar in the county seat. Carl? You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you got it all figured out. The words stumbled over each other like drunks leaving church. Well, let me tell you something, you pathetic old fool. Frank almost hung up. Almost. But something in Carl's voice, some note of desperation beneath the rage, made him listen. Rebecca told me everything. About your worthless life, your worthless house, your worthless everything. You know what she calls you. Her biggest mistake. Says marrying you was like being buried alive for 37 years. Each word hit like a physical blow, but Frank kept listening. She's embarrassed, Frank. Embarrassed she ever had your name. That's why she needs this to be clean. Needs you to just disappear. Sign the papers, take your little crazy man pension, and disappear. What papers? Carl laughed, ugly and sharp. The ones you're going to sign at the wedding, old man. Right in front of everyone. Going to give Rebecca the mineral rights as a wedding gift because you're such a generous, forgiving ex-husband. Everyone will think it's so noble. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. And if I don't? Then we destroy you, piece by piece. Your reputation, your relationship with those kids you're so fond of, your standing in this pathetic little town. By the time we're done, nobody will believe a word you say about anything. The line went quiet except for Carl's heavy breathing and the sound of bar music in the background. You still there, Frank? You hearing me? Frank looked around his kitchen, at the children's drawing stuck to his refrigerator with magnets, at Martha's pie plate still sitting on the counter, at his father's old coffee cup sitting in the dish drainer. I hear you, Carl. Good. Because if you don't show up Saturday and do exactly what we tell you, those kids are going to learn some very unpleasant truths about their precious Grandpa Frank. Amazing what people will believe when the right kind of evidence gets presented the right way. The line went dead. Frank sat in his kitchen for a long time after that, coffee growing cold in his hands. Outside, the night sounds of Millfield drifted through his open windows, crickets singing, a train whistle in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves in the oak tree that had shaded his house since he was a boy. For the first time since Rebecca left, Frank Morrison allowed himself to cry. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he was about to risk losing. The love of 3 children who called him Grandpa, the respect of a community that had known him all his life, the simple dignity of being known as a good man. When the tears stopped, something else took their place. Something harder and cleaner and sharp as winter moonlight. Frank Morrison was done being afraid. Saturday morning came crisp and clear, the kind of June day that made a man grateful to be alive. Frank stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the tie on a suit he'd never worn. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, bought 3 days ago with Martha's enthusiastic approval. You clean up real nice, Frank Morrison, he told his reflection. The man looking back at him stood straighter, looked steadier, carried himself like someone who knew his own worth. The Rolls-Royce sat in his driveway like a silver dream, all chrome and leather and quiet power. Cal Turner's nephew ran a luxury car rental service in the city, and when Cal explained the situation, the boy had insisted on delivering the finest vehicle in his fleet personally. No charge, he'd said, grinning. Any friend of Uncle Cal who's about to stick it to some city slickers has my full support. Frank walked outside to find Martha waiting by the car, wearing her best blue dress and a smile that could power the county. Behind her, 3 small figures bounced with excitement. Surprise! Sarah launched herself at Frank's waist, careful not to wrinkle his new suit. Mom said we could come if we promised to be good. Tommy Jr. stepped forward, looking serious in his church clothes. Grandpa Frank, we voted. We're not letting you face the mean lady alone. Michael nodded solemnly. Daddy always said family stands together. Frank's throat tightened. These children, who had every reason to fear losing another father figure, were choosing to stand with him when it mattered most. Y'all sure about this? This might get ugly. We're sure, Tommy Jr. said, speaking for all of them. Besides, we want to see you tell that lady what for. Martha opened the Rolls-Royce's rear door with a flourish. Your chariot awaits, Mr. Morrison. The drive to Millfield Country Club took 20 minutes through countryside that had never looked more beautiful. Frank sat in the front passenger seat, breathing in the scent of leather and possibility, while the children chattered excitedly in the back about the car's fancy features. Look, Grandpa Frank? Michael pressed his face to the window. People are staring. They were indeed. Cars slowed as the Rolls-Royce passed, drivers craning their necks to see who was inside. Frank waved politely at Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, whose jaw dropped so far it probably needed medical attention. Showtime, Martha murmured as they pulled into the country club's circular drive. The parking lot was full of familiar cars, Rebecca's old crowd, most of whom had dropped Frank like a hot potato after the divorce. Now they gathered in small clusters, whispering and pointing as the Rolls-Royce glided to a stop right in front of the main entrance. Frank took a deep breath, tasting champagne and expensive perfume on the air. Through the car's windows, he could see the wedding guests in their finery, and beyond them, a figure in white that made his stomach clench. Rebecca. Even at 58, she was beautiful in the way that money could make a woman beautiful. Perfect hair, perfect dress, perfect smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Standing beside her, Carl Whitmore looked like a man who'd swallowed something unpleasant. His face was pale despite his expensive tan, and his hands shook as he straightened his tie. "You ready for this?" Martha asked. Frank looked at the children in the rearview mirror, three faces full of love and trust and fierce loyalty. He thought about Carl's midnight threats, about Rebecca's calculated cruelty, about 2 years of believing he wasn't enough. "I've been ready for this longer than I knew." The uniformed driver opened Frank's door with professional precision. Frank stepped out, feeling every eye in the parking lot lock onto him like searchlights. The murmur of conversation died to whispers, then to silence. He walked around to help Martha from the car, then opened the rear door for the children. Tommy Jr. emerged first, straightening his shoulders like a soldier. Sarah and Michael flanked him, all three holding their heads high. Frank offered Martha his arm. "Shall we go to a wedding?" The country club's lobby buzzed with voices that went quiet as Frank's party entered. He nodded to old friends and former neighbors, most of whom looked like they'd seen a ghost. A few brave souls approached with tentative smiles and awkward congratulations on his apparent good fortune. Frank Morrison? Hank from the barber shop stared like Frank had risen from the dead. "That you in that fancy suit?" "It's me, Hank. How you been?" "Good, good. You look—" Hank searched for words. "You look prosperous." "Feeling pretty good these days," Frank agreed. Through the crowd, he could see Rebecca watching from the doorway to the main ballroom. Her face had gone white as her wedding dress. Carl stood beside her, whispering urgently in her ear. Frank straightened his father's watch on his wrist and smiled. "Well," he said to Martha and the children, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet lobby, "I believe there's a wedding about to start. Hate to keep the happy couple waiting." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Frank Morrison walked toward his reckoning. The country club's main ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White roses and golden ribbons, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across tables set with china that probably cost more than Frank's truck. 200 guests in their finest clothes all turned to watch his entrance. Rebecca stood at the front of the room near the altar, her hands clenched so tight around her bouquet that Frank could see her knuckles from 50 feet away. Carl whispered something urgent in her ear, but she shook her head, eyes locked on Frank like he was a nightmare made real. "Grandpa Frank," Sarah whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "She looks scared." "Sometimes people get scared when they realize they've made mistakes, sweetheart." Frank walked down the center aisle, nodding politely to guests he recognized. Martha and the children followed, forming a small but determined parade. Conversations died in their wake, replaced by the kind of whispers that spread through small towns like wildfire. Halfway to the altar, Frank stopped. The silence stretched taut as a guitar string. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the room. "You look beautiful. Marriage suits you." She stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. "Frank, what are you— How did you— How did I afford the nice suit? The fancy car?" Frank smiled, the kind of smile that didn't have any meanness in it, just truth. "Turns out I'm not quite as poor as some folks thought." Carl stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "You have no right to be here. We have a restraining order." "No, Carl, you don't." The voice came from the back of the room. Cal Turner walked down the aisle, dressed in his best Sunday suit and carrying a briefcase that had seen better decades. "That order was based on false statements and fraudulent evidence. I've filed papers with the county clerk this morning to have it dismissed." Rebecca's bouquet trembled in her hands. "I don't understand. Frank, you can't afford lawyers. You can't afford any of this." "Funny thing about assumptions," Frank said gentle. "Sometimes they make fools of us all." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "I brought you a wedding gift, Rebecca, just like you wanted." Carl's eyes lit up with greedy triumph. "The mineral rights deed. You came to your senses after all." Frank nodded to Tommy Jr., who stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. Actually, the deed's in here. Thought it deserved a proper presentation. Rebecca's hands shook as she opened the box. Inside, nestled in white satin, was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it, read it once, then again. The color drained from her face like water from a sink. This is for the Henderson property, the swampland behind the old mill. That's right, Frank said cheerfully. Figured you and Carl could use some worthless ground to match your worthless promises. The wedding guests murmured, sensing drama but not understanding the details. Carl snatched the deed from Rebecca's hands, read it, and let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Where are the real mineral rights? He demanded. The Cooper Ridge property? Frank smiled wider. Safe in a trust fund for these 3 children. Seems the right thing to do, passing wealth to the next generation instead of letting it get stolen by folks who think love can be bought and sold. Rebecca's voice came out as a whisper. You knew. You knew what we were planning. I knew you sent that invitation to hurt me. I knew you filed false charges to scare me. I knew you and Carl were scheming to steal my daddy's legacy. Frank's voice stayed gentle, but it carried to every corner of the room. What I didn't know until this week was how much I was worth. Turns out being poor was a choice, not a sentence. Martha stepped forward, producing another document from her purse. The real estate appraisal on Frank's mineral rights. $2.7 million as of yesterday's survey. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Rebecca swayed on her feet like she might faint. Frank looked around the ballroom, at faces he'd known all his life, at people who'd written him off as a failure and were now seeing him with new eyes. I want y'all to know something, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd found his backbone. For 2 years, I let myself believe I wasn't enough. Wasn't smart enough, rich enough, man enough to keep what I'd promised to love and protect. He looked directly at Rebecca, and his voice softened with something that might have been pity. But I learned something this week. A man's worth isn't measured in dollars or fancy cars or country club memberships. It's measured in love freely given and received, in promises kept and kindness shown, in being the kind of person children want to call Grandpa. Tommy Jr. stepped closer to Frank, followed by Sarah and Michael. Without a word, they formed a protective circle around the man who'd chosen them as surely as they'd chosen him. I forgive you, Rebecca, Frank said, simple and clean. Both of you. But I won't be your victim anymore. He turned to address the wedding guests, many of whom were openly weeping. Y'all enjoy the party. Dance, eat cake, celebrate love wherever you find it. Frank offered Martha his arm again. Come on, family. Let's go home. As they walked back down the aisle, Frank heard someone start to clap. Then another person joined in, then another, until the entire ballroom thundered with applause that followed them all the way to the parking lot. Behind them, Rebecca Morrison Whitmore stood at her own altar, holding a deed to worthless swampland, and wondering when her perfect plan had become her perfect nightmare. 3 months later, Frank Morrison sat on his front porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. The house looked different now. Fresh paint, new gutters, a porch that no longer sagged. Not because the money demanded it, but because a man ought to take pride in his home. Martha rocked in the chair beside him, both of them wearing simple gold bands that had belonged to her parents. No fancy wedding, no country club reception, just a quiet ceremony in Frank's backyard with Cal Turner officiating and 3 children serving as the world's most enthusiastic wedding party. Penny for your thoughts, Martha said, her voice soft as evening air. Frank watched Tommy Jr. teaching Sarah and Michael how to bait fishing hooks down by the creek, their laughter mixed with the sound of water over stones and the distant call of a whippoorwill. Just thinking about what makes a man rich, he said. Took me 65 years to figure it out, but I reckon better late than never. The screen door creaked as Sarah bounded up the porch steps, her face flushed with excitement and creek water. Grandpa Frank, I caught one, a big one! Frank opened his arms, and she climbed onto his lap, muddy shoes and all. Behind her, the boys whooped with delight as they reeled in their own catches. That's my girl, Frank said, breathing in the smell of childhood and summer and infinite possibility. Now, Tell me about this fish of yours. Was it bigger than the car? Martha laughed, the sound like silver bells in the evening air. Don't encourage her, Frank Morrison. That fish is going to be the size of a whale by bedtime. As darkness settled over Millfield, Frank thought about Rebecca. Last he'd heard, she was working at a clinic in the city, her marriage to Carl having lasted exactly 3 weeks after the wedding disaster. Cal Turner said she'd been asking around about Frank, wondering if he might consider selling some of his mineral rights to help her with legal bills. Frank had sent word back through Cal. Tell her I hope she finds what she's looking for. Just hope she knows it when she sees it. Some folks called that forgiveness. Frank called it freedom. The children came running back from the creek, full of stories and promises to catch bigger fish tomorrow. Martha herded them inside for baths and hot chocolate, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts and the endless choir of crickets. He pulled out his father's watch, its steady tick marking time that felt precious now instead of empty. In his pocket was a letter from the adoption agency, making official what had been true in his heart for months. He was Grandpa Frank in name as well as love. A man's worth, Frank had learned, wasn't measured in bank accounts or country club memberships. It was measured in moments like this: children's laughter echoing across still water, a good woman's hand in his, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd chosen kindness over bitterness, dignity over revenge. The rest was just details. Frank Morrison rocked in his chair until the stars came out, listening to the sounds of home and thinking that 65 years wasn't too late to start living rich.